Hi there, welcome to Caritas Querens. In this video series, we're looking at some of the commonly asked questions about Christian universalism or apokatastasis, the doctrine that all people will eventually get to heaven. So for this first one, I've picked out what I think is probably the most common, or certainly one of the most commonly asked questions or objections to Christian universalism, and that is, isn't Christian universalism fundamentally unjust or unfair? So the understanding is, and a lot of times I will see the question posed in something like this. You know, what about somebody like Adolf Hitler, or like a serial killer, or serial rapist, or child trafficker? You know, think of somebody like just the dregs of humanity, egregious sinners. Okay, people will say, well, how is it fair that somebody like that just gets to heaven, while you have other people, like earthbound saints who basically are, spending their lives doing penance, praying, living very deeply spiritual lives, lives of great love and charity, right? Like, what's the point? Like, they could have just done whatever they wanted to, like these serial killers and rapists and everything, and gotten to heaven just as easily. So how is that fair? The egregious sinners should have to pay for their crimes, and it's not fair that they spent their lives in just total abasement and evil and still get heaven anyway. Okay, so that's a pretty strong objection, I have to say. I mean, at least from the surface of it, it looks pretty serious. So let's take a look at that. First of all, I'm gonna say this. In everything I've read, everything I've come across, videos I've watched, everything, I don't think I've ever come across a Christian universalist who believes that Christian universalism means that everybody just gets like a get into heaven free card or something. Like, you just die and God says, okay, let's see, you did lots and lots of penance, you gave away all your money, you prayed, 3 hours every day, so I'm going to let you go into heaven, And okay, next up, let's see, you murdered 50,000 people, you raped 10,000, you stole large sums of money, you lied regularly, consistently. It's like, and I'm going to send you into heaven. It's like, that's not how it works. And again, I've never come across anybody who has said that. I mean, there may be some out there, but from everything I've seen, all the serious Christian universalists, never seen that anybody puts it that way. There is always the understanding that Christian universalism entails God's justice. Okay, that we all, no matter what degree of holiness we attain in this life, we all, in a sense, have to pay for our sins. But there's kind of a different perspective, I would say. A lot of non-Christian universalists that I've read, it often seems like the idea of sin and repaying our sins, or making up for our sins, or it takes the form of basically a sort of legalistic punishment. So the idea is, you committed this sin, and now you have to suffer for it. It's kind of like in our U.S. legal system. It's like, okay, you get 10 years, or you get 2 years, or you get a life sentence, or whatever. Okay, it's often kind of seen that way. So from a Catholic perspective, we have this idea of purgatory, and for a while that was even the way it was talked about somebody going to purgatory for a certain number of years, and so it kind of took on that sense of a sort of legalistic, penal view of reparation for sin. A lot of Christian universalists that I've come across, in fact, I would say the vast majority, see it kind of differently. They say that really making up for our sins, or reparation for sins, is much more about the healing of the individual. So we would say that somebody who commits serious sins, take an Adolf Hitler, for instance. I'm not saying that what he's done, that what he did, is good or acceptable. It's awful. But one area that I see that Christian universalists will often emphasize, that where non-universalists usually won't, is saying that one thing we need to keep in mind and realize is that what Hitler did to other people, the sins he committed, actually harmed him in some ways far worse than he harmed anyone else. I remember coming across a quote from, I think it was St. Augustine, a long time ago. I can't trace it right now. I don't remember the source or anything, but where he says something to the effect of, every man's sins actually harm himself more than they harm anyone else. The murderer kills his own soul much more, deeply than he kills, another individual. A thief steals from himself more than he steals from anyone else. A liar lies more to himself than he lies to anyone else. And so that's the idea: is not that our sins do not hurt others, but that they also hurt ourselves. And so, really, in His justice, God takes care of those sins, not just by rewarding the victims, but with eternal happiness in heaven. I mean, think about that, for instance. If universalism is not true, you could have some people, some victims of serious crimes, who perhaps died in a state of mortal sin and go to hell forever. And how is anything rectified for them? Like all that they suffered in this life, how are they repaid for that? How is reparation made if they go straight to hell and are suffering interminably forever? You know? So really, Christian universalism seems to be more fair for the victims of serious crimes as well, but certainly for the perpetrators, because we say, no, certainly they have to make reparation for their sins, but that reparation is not just about putting in time in prison. It's about them, first and foremost, coming to terms with who they are, with what their sins are, how others have been affected by their sins, and I was going to say embracing that. Maybe that's not the best word, but embracing it, owning up to it, taking responsibility for it, and then secondly, then really experiencing in some way what their sins have done to them. It makes me think of the story of the Garden of Eden, where after Adam and Eve sinned by eating the fruit, they noticed their own nakedness. So one of the first things that happens is they recognize their own abasement. And that's what happens, according to most Christian universalists I've read, is that great sinners, not just great sinners, all of us really, have to come to terms with what we have done, what we've made of ourselves by our sins, must take ownership of that, and then must really make true reparation, which means that we are really healed from within of those sins. So if there is some kind of punishment, if there is some kind of even penal aspect to the suffering for our sins, it has a corrective purpose. So it is there not just to like satisfy justice, and so that people can say, "Ha! Now you're getting what you're owed," but it's really about getting the person to become who they were meant to be in the first place, and recognizing that all of their sins have really just impeded that. So, is Christian universalism fundamentally unjust? No. In fact, I would say that even from a Catholic perspective, especially, even those who go to heaven, we acknowledge what we call purgatory. That some people, after they die, are not ready to go straight to heaven, and so Catholic tradition has, and Catholic teaching, I should say, has also the idea of purgatory, a place where a person can be purged of lesser sins or defects and faults and failings. So even those who go to heaven, they have to go through that purgation, that purification process. I guess you could almost think of it as like fire. Think you have metal, and sometimes the fire is used to get out the dross, get out all the impurities, and then maybe later on the fire is used to get the metal good and hot so that it can be beaten into shape, beaten into some purpose or purposeful shape that the Creator has for it. And then later on, the fire might also be used to temper the metal, to make it perfect, to make it complete or finished, right? And so all of these things, that the fire of God's love is acting in all of these ways for those who are serious, egregious sinners, as well as those who maybe are lesser sinners, you might say. I don't know. Honestly, the more I live, the harder it is for me, in a sense, to even draw a clear distinction between a great sinner and a lesser sinner. I think all sin just seems to me just terribly stupid, foolish, and also just terribly wrong. But anyway, so no, I don't think it's unjust at all. We're not saying that people get off the hook. Everyone has to face what they've done. for the good of others, for the good of the whole human race, as well as for their own good. Now, this brings up in my mind a couple other issues, though. One of which is when we say this, isn't Christian universalism fundamentally unjust? And we're obviously focusing on like serious sinners and how they ought to go to hell because they've done a lot of really bad things. It sets up this kind of false dichotomy between mercy and justice, and it's like, so what does that mean? Does that mean that like for all the really pious people go to heaven, that like that God is what, he's just merciful to them, so that he can be just on the condemned, on the reprobate or something, like that sometimes is how it's actually phrased and explained. Okay, I mean, part of me wants to say, well, hey, God in a certain sense is not even really totally just on the saints who go to heaven. Like he oftentimes is better to us than we deserve, right? But realistically, I think you could say that God's mercy is on all, right? God shows mercy even to the good, but he also does show justice and demand justice on the saints. So he, like I said, we will all have to face what we've done, take responsibility for it, and be purified, be cleansed, and be perfected. So I think oftentimes those who are more pious, who are the saintly people who go right to heaven, they go through that during this life. This life is their passage from hell to purgatory to heaven. That's the point of some of the penances that they do, and the intense times of prayer that they have, and often the sufferings that God Himself permits or sends to purify them. They're I think the saints, if you ask them, could say, no, we've been through the crucible of God's justice as well. So I don't like seeing this kind of dichotomy between mercy and justice. No, all experience God's justice, all experience God's mercy. Really, it is, I guess you could say that God is showing us in His justice by insisting that we become who we were meant to be, by creating us with a purpose, by creating me and you and every individual with a very particular, specific purpose. And I believe that every individual person has a distinct purpose that is distinct from every other individual. I like to see it as almost like, like when you see a diamond that is exquisitely cut, all these different edges and, I don't know the terminology, but, all these different edges and corners and everything. And then you see somebody like shine light on it and how it sparkles, I like to think of it as God as like this exquisite diamond, this multifaceted, infinite-sided diamond. And each of us individually is like one of those glimmers, one of those sparkles of the diamond of God. So anyway, if God has created each of us distinct with a unique purpose, then in a sense He kind of owes us. Maybe I'm speaking a little bit out of turn here, but I'm speaking by analogy in a sense. In a sense, God kind of owes it to us to make sure that we become who we are meant to be, and kind of owes it to Himself, maybe is a better way of saying it, to show His glory through each of us in the way that He has intended. So I think really, in a sense, Christian universalism emphasizes God's justice by saying, no, God insists that everyone receive their just due, that everyone, if they've done good things, that yes, they get rewarded, whatever that means, but also if they have committed sins, that it gets rectified, and they still become who they are meant to be, so that they can express His glory alongside of the rest of humanity. Another thing I want to just mention here, because I did mention in previous video about how oftentimes the infernalist position kind of gets off the hook and doesn't really have to explain their position. But, when you look at the two main camps, so to speak, amongst infernalists, there are some, the so-called Thomists or Calvinists, who tend to say, well, God actually, before anybody did anything, God chose some people to go to heaven. He predestined them. And it's not because of anything that God foresaw, any merits or demerits, any sins or good deeds that they did. He just chose them, okay? Now, that to me seems actually to be problematic when it comes to justice. because I think a person could legitimately ask, okay, why did God choose this person? And usually the answer is, well, God has his own reasons. God has reasons of his own that, are beyond us that we can't comprehend. Okay, fine. But still, it seems to me awfully unfair. Seems to me awfully unfair that a person, just because they're not chosen, that they don't get the grace they need to get to heaven, and therefore they go to hell and they suffer endlessly. I don't know. That seems to me kind of unfair. And to say, well, it's because after the fact they did end up sinning, so God's punishing them for their sins. Okay, but a lot of the people who end up going to heaven who are predestined, I mean, they commit sins too, right? So why is it that God chose them to show his mercy, and other people he chose to show his justice? That just doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem fair to God either, because it makes this kind of solid demarcation between God's mercy and justice. When God, according to most sane theologians, God is the ultimate being. God is not just or merciful. God is justice. He is mercy. Justice and mercy are not just like qualities of God; they are who he is. they're in a sense aspects of his essence. And if that's the case, then it's not fair in a sense to say, well, God, in this area you're not just, or in this area you're not merciful. How's that fair when he is mercy? He is justice, right? Anyway, so that's the Thomist or Calvinist perspective. I think that actually seems to me to be problematic when it comes to God's justice. The other is the so-called free will or Arminian notion, and that is basically saying, well, everybody has free will, so we can choose to reject God, and if we do, God still wants us to go to heaven, but he respects our free will decision, and he allows us to basically choose hell for ourselves, choose to go to hell, right? At first glimpse, that seems to be a lot less problematic, and it seems fair. God is saying, you choose hell? Okay, I'll respect that and let you go to hell. But it does bring up to me some issues, like we have to look at why do people make the free decisions they do? I don't think it's as simple as just saying, well, this person just chose hell. Nobody just chooses hell, right? It's rather a series of decisions that people make throughout their lives, and often these decisions have nothing apparent to do about heaven or hell. They have to do with very specific things, like telling a little white lie here, or breaking the speed limit there, or stealing some money here, or whatever, right? So my question is, or my thought is, how do we account for all the things that go into the free decisions we make? And when you consider that very many people in this world have some very unfavorable circumstances, whether it's their upbringing, faulty upbringing, abuse, oftentimes abusive upbringing, whether it's the circumstances they live in, living in a sort of, dog-eat-dog world, the culture they live in. People oftentimes are just sort of raised by the culture, and they imbibe some very bad moral principles. And oftentimes it's hard for people to break out of this. So, how is, in a sense, I want to say, how is that fair that people have to deal with all this and still make the right decisions? And oftentimes within the span of about 70 years or so. I'm not saying that there are no answers to these questions, but that seems to me at least as problematic as the idea of Christian universalism being unjust. So anyway, those are my thoughts. If you enjoy this, if you'd like to hear more, please like this video and subscribe, and hit the comment box below. What are your thoughts on this issue? Do you think Christian universalism is unjust? If so, why? Do you think it's not? Do you agree with me? Do you have any other insights? And what other questions do you have about Christian universalism that maybe I could address on a future video? Until next time, adios.